Inky, are you going to help me talk about the 10th edition rulebook? You've got it memorized, right, girl? Yeah, she knows what's up. She's so smart. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we are talking a little bit more about the 10th edition Warhammer 40k rulebook that was leaked just earlier this week, almost in its entirety. We basically have essentially the entire thing, and it's answered a ton of questions for us for how the turn-to-turn gameplay of Warhammer 40k 10th edition is going to progress. So what I want to do is talk about my picks for the biggest changes in the rulebook. In this video, I'm going to be talking about mechanics that have changed from their version in 9th edition. So today we're going to be skipping over stratagems, and we're going to be skipping over mechanics that are wholly new within the edition. There's a lot of new stuff in here, like new weapon abilities and the ability for characters to attach into units and exactly how that works, and we're not going to be covering that today. Instead, we're going to be covering those rules that have gotten a structural change. As always, if you enjoy my Warhammer 40k content and my coverage of 10th edition Warhammer 40k, there's been a lot of it this week, and I appreciate everyone's support. But if you haven't yet, dropped a subscribe on the channel and like on the video. All that YouTube stuff, you know what's up, really helps get the word out and grow the community, so I really appreciate it. And let's dive in. These are in no particular order, but I figure I'll go down through the chronological order of gameplay, I guess. So number one, we have the movement phase and the newfound ability of models to move through other models. That's right, everyone's basically a ghost now because you can just phase through people, at least as long as you're on your own team. This is a pretty common mechanic that we're seeing being put into a lot of games, mostly to kind of reinforce the narrative that your team is actually a well-oiled machine and your units are not going to get stuck on each other or bump into each other. They know what they're doing, and they can move in a sequence that is the most appropriate for them. While they can't end movements on top of each other, they can move through friendly units, provided, of course, that both they and the unit that they're moving through are not vehicles or monsters. Those big heavies are too large and ponderous to get through each other and coordinate effectively, so they're going to have to move around. You still sequence your movement phase like you did in 9th edition, so you're just going to have to move the ones in front first, so that's not really that big of an issue. That said, infantry and other unit types can move through these models without penalty and even through other models in their army, as long as they don't stand on top of each other, which makes your turn-to-turn gameplay so much easier. However, enemy models will still block movement, and their engagement range still can't be entered when normally performing moves, so you'll have to worry about that. Now, the other way that units can move through other models is potentially moving through enemy models, and this is using the new fallback mechanics. When a unit falls back, it is allowed to move over enemies. However, for every model that does so, they're going to have to take a desperate escape check. On the d6 roll of a 1 or a 2 for each of these checks that's made, one model in that unit is going to be destroyed. So you can't be wrapped as easily as you could previously, where your opponent would surround you with models and prevent your unit from leaving combat to lock it in. Now you can just declare a fallback and move through that opposing enemy unit. However, there is a good chance that you'll lose some models on the way out. If you're battle shocked and do any kind of fallback move at all, the entire unit is going to have to take that desperate escape check. But the important thing is that the controlling player of the unit gets to choose which of those models is destroyed. So rolling a 1 or a 2 if your character is wrapped doesn't necessarily mean that the character within a unit is automatically dead. Moving on to the next one, we do have another unit type that can move through models. Flying units have had another big change. These things previously have been able to ignore vertical distance when moving around the battlefield. They're assumed to be flying high above and are able to take off and land from vertical elements without penalty. In the new edition, however, they operate a lot differently. Instead, they use a mechanic called moving through the air. They still maintain their position on the battlefield. They're represented by a miniature that's on the table, but when moving up or down vertical terrain, they measure their distance moved diagonally. The rulebook indicates that this is meant to be done from the back of the base to the back of the base, and you'll ignore any lip that you're moving over with that flying model. It's a little bit of an awkward rule, but it does give those flying models the ability to charge up and down buildings much more easily than they did in 9th edition. So while their movement is going to be a little bit tougher than it was in the past, their charges are going to be so much scarier. Next up, let's move into weapons and the shooting phase, and the big one I want to talk about here is hazardous weapons, because these got a huge change. Now, this is a new keyword in the new edition, but it refers to weapons that had effects that would damage their user. These are now applied to psychic powers, where it represents perils of the warp in the now removed psychic phase, and also plasma weapons and overcharged weapons that you would find oftentimes would kill or damage the user on the hit roll of 1. Instead of being tied to a hit roll now, however, hazardous weapons have a separate check that they make after they've been fired. Unlike in the past, where you would be able to add rerolls or a character auras that would make it much less likely that you'd roll those ones to hit, now, because it's not tied to a hit roll, it doesn't matter how many rerolls you have. That said, the hazardous weapon check is only rolled once for each hazardous weapon that's fired. So even if you're firing a ton of shots with plasma blasters, for example, on an Inceptor squad, you're only going to roll 1 dice for each plasma blaster that's been fired at the overcharge profile. Each of those hazardous weapon tests is very similar to those desperate escape tests we talked about in the movement phase. They roll a d6. On a 2+, they're okay. On a 1, one model with a hazardous weapon from that unit of the controlling player's choice is destroyed. If that model was a character, monster, or vehicle, instead of being destroyed, it just suffers 3 mortal wounds. Interestingly, this can add mortal wounds to a character that's attached to a unit, even if someone else in the unit has already been wounded, which is a situation we couldn't have happen in 9th edition, but can come up pretty often now in 10th. Moving back to the shooting phase, we did see a change to Big Guns Never Tire that is enormous. This is the ability in 9th edition that allowed vehicles and monsters to fire their weapons into melee. Previously, it imposed the hit penalty on heavy weapons fired into melee, but now that we have the change to weapon abilities and attributes and how weapon types are determined, that now affects any non-pistol weapons that those monsters or vehicles are shooting. However, there is another huge change to Big Guns Never Tire that works against monsters and vehicles, and that is the ability for other units to fire into melee with a monster and vehicle that is engaging their own units at a -1 to hit penalty to themselves. Now, both of these penalties are not applied to pistols, so pistols can both be fired in melee and into melee with monsters and vehicles without penalty, but it does make monsters and vehicles a lot less safe when engaging enemy units in close combat, because enemy non-blast weapons are going to be able to fire into them and potentially kill them without any enemies needing to fall back. Now let's move on to charges and fight phases. We've seen some huge changes to both of these phases, and charges are one of them. The biggest change is that charging models must now move towards the target of their charge. They are no longer able to use charges just as free movement to go any direction that they want. And while this is still largely in control of the controlling player, it is still a little bit directed, since charging models not only have to move closer to those target units, but also, if it's possible for them to move into base-to-base contact, they must do so. This is in the order that the controlling player chooses, so they can take up the base-to-base real estate that is nearby the target unit, so that some other models may get a little bit more freedom on their charge by having their landing zone obstructed by other models of their unit. Keep in mind, though, that models will still move through each other. There's no indication that the ability that's described in the movement phase that allows friendly models to ignore each other for movement doesn't take place when performing other kinds of moves, so that does open you up a lot. You can have a unit in front of your unit fail a charge, and the units behind can still attempt it without their movement being blocked by the intervening friendly models. In addition, you're going to be able to charge through other models of your squad, so you're going to be able to make those charge moves a little bit more easy. Now, this is a big deal because in the fight phase, the models that can fight are changed significantly. After you performed your pile and consolidate moves, which we are going to talk about momentarily, you can only attack with models that are within engagement range of an enemy model, that being 1 inch, or that are in base-to-base contact with another friendly model that is in base-to-base contact with an opponent. In 9th edition, this had a 1/2 inch range on it, which allowed a model to be 1 inch plus base size away from a target unit. Now they must be base-to-base, which requires them to move a little bit closer and makes it so that you're probably going to be moving those models directly towards your opponent anyway with your charges in order to get them stuck in. Now, when it comes to the fight phase, there have been some big changes, and the next big one is the defender's priority when fighting. 9th edition had a very complex interaction between attacker and defender in the fight phase, and 10th edition retains that but it looks like we'll have less of an emphasis on fight last effects. Instead, the defending player, the player whose turn is not taking place, gets to choose the first fighter in every step of the sequence. So if they have units that have a fight first effect applied to them and they're able to fight first in combats as if they had charged, the defender will get to fight with one of their units first. If that unit has a fight first effect on it and it is charged by an enemy, it will still get to swing before the enemy. Even units in ongoing combats that didn't charge that turn, just like in 9th edition, will still get chosen by the player whose turn is not taking place. It's just that if there are fight first effects widely in the game, those are going to make it incredibly difficult to charge into those squads. Now, if you've completed the charges and you've selected your fighters, piling in and consolidating, the combat movements that happen before and after a unit makes their attacks have been totally redesigned as well. Both of these movements do not take place if the unit performing them is not in engagement range of an enemy unit at the end. So for example, if you have charged into an ongoing combat and the target of your charge is destroyed before that unit goes to pile in or consolidate, if it's not within 4 inches of any enemies, it cannot pile in because none of those moves can get it within engagement range of an enemy model. If it can pile in, the pile-in moves that it makes are still towards the closest enemy model on a model per model basis, just like they were in 9th edition, but if you are able to get to base contact just like the charge phase, you are required to do so. Again, this is in the order that the controlling player chooses, so you can potentially do some chicanery to try to manipulate it. The consolidate move is very similar. It cannot be performed if you cannot engage an enemy at the end of that move, and if you're able to move into base-to-base contact, you must do so. However, if you don't have any eligible units that you can move up to and engage, you are able to instead move towards the nearest objective marker, assuming that you can get a model within range of that objective marker. You can basically, if you don't have an eligible enemy unit to run at, you can instead use the objective marker as a stand-in for an enemy, and if you can move up to and get within that 3-inch kind of engagement range of that marker, then you're good to go. This gives consolidation moves a little bit more flexibility, and units are able to use those to take objectives. It means that you cannot ring an objective with models, and if your opponent charges and kills it, they're not stuck, not able to get onto the objective, but it does restrict your pile-in and consolidate moves significantly. So those are the biggest core mechanical changes to Warhammer 40k 10th edition, at least in my opinion. Did you notice any other ones in the rulebook? If you want a full breakdown of the rulebook, I did do one the day that they were spoiled, so you can go check that one out. And if you notice any other huge changes that you want to point out, let me know down in the comment section. I'm going to be doing some more videos talking about these stratagems and other abilities that were spoiled in this rulebook. There's a lot to go over here, so there's a ton of information to talk about, but so I hope you stay tuned for that. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great. And I love you so much. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.